feels strange to give a talk without him credited. So I wanted to mention that first. The other thing is that I understand that this series is not necessarily aimed directly at the ecological audience, that it is aimed at the inactive audience. And while they are certainly cousins, at least, they're not identical. So I'm going to be talking a lot about ecological because that is my bag, but I do think a lot of this is going to resonate with that audience as well. So this is what I'm here to do. So as you mentioned, I have my degree from the Center for the Ecological Study of Perception and Action and Cognition. They've changed the name since I was there, but it was always and cognition. It's worth mentioning. My advisor was Claudia Corello, and I actually went to UConn as an undergraduate as well, and took sensation and perception with Claudia Corello, and absolutely fell in love with the whole thing, and sort of followed her. Said, well, I want to go learn more. I want to learn more about this. It's amazing. It's so interesting, and became a graduate student, and fairly rapidly began to feel like the barrier for entry to ecological was incredibly high. And it wasn't because I didn't have amazing teachers. I had amazing teachers, but it's very complex stuff and there is a lot of it. And I found myself in this position of feeling like I didn't understand anything and I'm all alone in not understanding anything, which I have since learned is not true. And that it's very difficult to sort of get into to begin with. And then, years down the line, I did, but I started talking to other people and discovered a similar sentiment, right? I heard that same kind of sentiment repeated to me by other students, by professors who are trying to teach this material and going, it's so hard to get started because there's so few materials written at a basic level. I mean, Gibson himself wrote at a wonderfully basic level. I love his writing for that. And there was another book published around the same time called Direct Perception that was written by Claudia and also Claire Michaels. But both of those are now 40 years out of date and so missing some of the development since then. At any rate, because of all of that, Jeff Wagman and I decided to write Introduction to Ecological Psychology. All right, so that was the sort of impetus behind writing that book, was the desire to help lower that barrier to entry into the field, because we genuinely do think this can be of great use to a lot of different areas of psychology. And what's been sort of fun about this is that exactly that. There's been a lot of people outside of ecological who have contacted us because of this book. So we've talked with the batting coach of the New York Mets. We talked with a guy who runs an ecological martial arts gym. Which, yeah, so cool. We talk with a woman who is a clinical psychologist and wants to really expand on the notion of an ecological clinical psychology. I've talked to social psychologists who think there's really something important in the dynamic systems modeling. It's finding an audience not just in the little insular world of ecological, but in other places as well. And I tell this story that we wrote it so that my mother, who is a very smart woman but had no idea what I did for a living, could read it and then know what I did for a living. And I tell the joke that she hadn't read it, but actually just recently she started reading and she's read the first couple of chapters. And she is an artist. And in reading it has found applications to her art, which is, I think, is just so neat. So to me, it's like there's a neat message here that a lot of people are getting things out of. And that's been really great. But it doesn't necessarily solve my everyday problem, which is that as a professor at CCSU, I am trying to teach sensation and perception, and I run into the problem of what book do I use? And when you really start investigating those books, you start discovering that it doesn't necessarily have a great selection when it comes to trying to teach that ecological perspective. So I, for years, used the same textbook that Claudia used with us when I was an undergrad. But then a couple of years back, decided, okay, for reasons I'll explain a little bit later, it's time to go and find a new text. one that maybe does a better job. So I went out into the literature, and tried to find every sensation and perception textbook I could. Now, it's not a fully systematic search. I am positive I missed some. I'm positive that someone out there is gonna be like, oh, wait, I've got this other book that's you. I'm sure. I didn't do a fully systematic search, but I did contact every major publisher and get the books of theirs that were still in print, right? So anything that's still being manufactured. I did a thorough Amazon and Google search. I looked at both books that exist only online and books that exist in print. I looked as much as I possibly could, and I ended up reviewing several dozen texts. I would also like to point out that 99% of them are called sensation and perception, which makes searching for it very hard. Just putting that out there. At any rate, what I did with those texts is I looked through two places. I looked through the table of contents for the book, and then if it was available, I looked in the index as well. And I was looking for really any indication that they cover the ecological perspective. So I was looking for words like ecological and affordances, Gibson, direct perception, basically any embodied, embedded, anything I could find that might indicate that this book was going to be covering the direct perception approach. I didn't look for the phrase optic flow, and it's because it's surprising the number of books that use that phrase optic flow, but what they mean by it is retinal image that's in motion. So they still treat it like the retinal image, talk about it like a retinal image, and it is not a Gibson thing. It is not an ecological thing. They're not using it the way we do. So I would have ended up with a lot of books that didn't do what we needed them to do if I'd used that. Anyway, in the course of all of this, I found seven. Out of all of those texts that I reviewed, I found seven that had any mention of the ecological perspective at all. I ordered desk copies of them. This is an actual photograph of my stack of books that I have. And I went through them. One of them, it turned out, was not actually our Gibson. It's like a whole different Gibson, who was apparently involved with the Gestaltists, but it's not our guy. Two of them had what amounts to a box feature, right? So it's like a 1 to 2 page, very brief explainer of what ecological is. I had a mention of, oh, Gibson started it, and that was kind of it. Two of them straight up just did a hit job. One of them, the only line in the entire text about it was, though the notion of direct perception has not proved fruitful. And then the other one had a little section about it. And then at the end of it said, oh, but it's been disproven because you see, AI cannot reconstruct scenes from static images. So this is the point where my department secretary caught me yelling at the books, um, which is maybe not a helpful response, but was an honest one nonetheless. So I found two that actually cover the ecological approach as sort of an integrated part of the whole. One of which is the one that I had been using for years that Claudia used, which was the Goldstein text. But in recent editions, it's become the Goldstein-Brockmole text. I think possibly Brockmole has been the one revising it for the new editions. And Brockmole is strictly a Helmholtzian and is trying to essentially change direct perception into indirect perception. So the affordances, the description of it is very cue based, and it essentially becomes a cue for meaning instead of being meaning itself. It's not great, which is why I started this journey in the first place. And I found one other that is okay. What it has is accurate. What it has is correct. It's just not comprehensive. So, I can use it, but it's not going to be enough to actually fully explain the ecological perspective to my undergraduate students. But better than something that's getting it wrong, I guess. Right. So going forward, that's what I decided to do. I decided to use that text, which for reference is the Yontis and Abrams text. It's on the second edition now. And like I said, it does a fine job. It's just not nearly comprehensive enough. So my reaction to that was, well, fine, I'll just supplement it with chapters from my book, which I provided to the students in PDF form. Please don't tell my publisher. I felt bad about making them buy two books. So they got PDFs of some of my chapters. They got the Antis and Abrams text. The Antis and Abrams. Anyway, and it's fine, but it's still not great. I still find myself in a position of not having one text that tells a narrative that takes you from one end of this field to the other end of this field in a comprehensive way. And at this point, we start talking, we being Jeff and I start talking about kind of the other issues surrounding the education of ecological. A lot of the time, by the time that people get to learning ecological, they've already learned all this other crap first. And so you end up having to unteach all of that first, which always feels to me like having to have a whole day where you talk about, no, really, the world isn't flat. It's not. Let me explain why, and then I will give you this overall picture of it as a sphere. And it's frustrating to have to unteach that every time. So I find myself really wishing that there was an introductory text that included the perspective, that wasn't just a box feature or sort of mentioning it as an afterthought, that really it was very integrated. And the other thing to keep in mind is that it is not always people who are sensation and perception trained who are teaching sensation and perception. When I started at CCSU, I was actually hired to teach biological psychology because I'm technically qualified to do that. And the woman who was teaching sensation and perception had her degree in biological psychology. Don't worry, at this point, we've done the swappity do, and she now teaches biopsych, and I teach S&P. But when she was teaching it, she wasn't trained in some of the cognitive aspects of it, or even like the difference between a direct versus indirect perception. And so when I would talk to her about it, she said, "Oh, well, she was just teaching out of the book." She would take the book chapter by chapter and present it to her class, which is fair because that's basically what I was doing in biopsych, if we're being honest. I'm also aware of the fact that at other universities, it is a cognition trained person. So they don't really have the grasp on the biology. It's a very cognitive based theory. And again, they're just going chapter by chapter. So I also sort of figured we could make a kind of Trojan horse situation, right? Where we make a textbook that includes that ecological perspective, includes everything. And then those people who weren't necessarily trained in it could be teaching it chapter by chapter, but be teaching this perspective, right? Figured it'd be sort of useful for that. So the end result of which is that Jeff Wagman and I are in the process of writing a textbook for sensation and perception, which we're calling Sensing and Perceiving. Make it a little easier to search for, maybe. It is due to our publishers this summer, which is fine. We're totally going to get it done. It's fine. Uh, it's fine. And we're working on it now, and it's going to contain the first third is entirely the biological perspective, but taught in a way that doesn't have to be untaught when you then get to the ecological perspective at the end. And then in the middle goes through the Helmholtzian perspective, the computational approach, and explains how it keeps sort of hitting its head on the ceiling and the ways in which it doesn't quite get there, but explains the traditional views. And then goes into a thoroughgoing ecological perspective, a lot of which is very similar to our first book. And as you mentioned, I'm going to do a little bit of a shilling for that book, which is that we are now working on other versions of it. I actually not just finished, now several months ago, finished recording an audio version. It is available now. So if you just want to listen to me talk for 16 hours instead of reading the book, you can now do that. We had people request it, which is why we did it. And we are actually going to be writing a second edition of the book. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more later. We're also looking to translate the book into other languages. So far, we've sent proposals to Hungarian publishers, or Hungarian language publishers, Spanish language publishers, and Portuguese language publishers, and are sort of waiting to hear back if they'd be interested in publishing a translation of the book. Because again, if you really want to get people early on, you got to get them in their native language. It's going to be easier for them to grasp it in that way. So that's very exciting. It's very exciting stuff happening. But I did want to mention one other thing here, which is about this second edition. So backing up to the very beginning of this talk, I mentioned that I was trained at CESPA with my advisor, Claudia Corello. Well, my co-author, Jeff, was also trained at CESPA, also with the exact same advisor. So one of the limitations we have found about this book is that it doesn't necessarily present like a very broad perspective. It really presents the perspective on which we were trained, which of course it does. That's the perspective on which we were trained. But we are sort of feeling like we would like to expand that if at all possible and include more nuance. So one of the things I am requesting of this audience is if you have suggestions for that, if you read the book and went, oh, it would have been great if you'd included, we really would like to hear about that, particularly like some readings that I could do to catch up on what I'm missing would be sort of useful in that regard, because we are looking for this to be a useful tool in teaching ecological perspective. So that's my pitch.
Excellent, thank you. So I think there was we continued to have a bit of technical difficulties. Your talk was all present, which was good,
Ah,
but my
good.
intro was, I think, I'm not sure my intro went out, but the all I can say is I shall sort of um, reiterate all of my enthusiasm and positivity for the project and
Sure.
for the entire series of books that you're currently editing with Jeffrey. So I have a few questions, and I guess they're mostly around some of these meta issues, and I'll keep an eye
Yeah,
on the chat on YouTube as well there, just to see if anyone watching the live stream has any questions. Just
great.
throw them into YouTube on the chat, and I will relay them into the conversation. Um, well, with various degrees of fluency. We'll see how that goes.
Okay.
Um, so, but I guess one of the things that I mentioned this to you before when we spoke before was the question as to why it took until 2020. Um, what
Yeah.
were I mean, there's probably some really interesting professional and historical reasons as to why uh, essentially undergrads were either undervalued or just deprioritized as an audience
Yeah.
for ecological psychology. And I'm curious as to what your take on that would be.
So I have two answers to this that I think are both equally weighted. One is that when a field is very young, it needs to spend its time figuring out what it is. This is sort of a personal observation, so I'm not sure about how true it is, but my like personal observation is so much of the early writing has a feeling of defensiveness, right? So there's a certain amount of like, no, you're wrong. No, you're wrong and I'm right and let me tell you why. Like there's a lot of that, which is I think what needed to happen, right? When you're coming up against a monolith, which is what, direct perception is, you have to do that. And you have to spend a lot of time doing that. And you have to spend a lot of time convincing people that you really know what you're talking about. And to do that, you have to figure out exactly what you're talking about. So I think there's a certain extent to which the field needed to figure itself out first. Also, writing a book is hard. I mean, I'm just being honest. It takes a lot of work, and a lot of times, especially given the way that we do tenure and promotion at universities, which is where most of these scientists are working, you really can't take the time off that is required to write a book because it's every day, and it's every day for a year or more, usually more. And in that time, you're supposed to have published 4 papers in order to get tenure at a Research One university. So I think a lot of people were not really in the position in their careers to be writing such a text. And even if they were, we're kind of going, yeah, but or I could, figure out more about what the field is. So this is, I think, what it was. And Jeff and I happened to come into it right at the time when, the field's absolutely matured enough to have a full and comprehensive view and also be in a position in our careers where that made sense. So COVID hit. We had like all, I mean, it was this sort of bizarre opportunity where I was home every day and my university was not expecting any productivity and we couldn't run participants anyway. So we talked about it and eventually decided, well, this will be our COVID project. Some people learn to bake bread. I wrote a book, right? And so I felt like it was very much a confluence of events that made this a possibility that it really wasn't before now.
Hmm. No, that's excellent. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's sort of interesting to sort of consider then some of the implications almost just for scientific practice that
Yeah,
undergraduate work and undergraduate communication requires a certain degree of sort of available resources in terms of
yeah,
just the number of active scientists in the field.
yeah. Oh,
And that
absolutely.
sort of spare capacity. Spare is a very strong, and awkward word in this context, but it's the sort of spare capacity within the professional body. So I guess it took that time to produce enough ecological psychologists to have the capacity to do this.
I think that's absolutely true. And let's be clear, we weren't the first people who came up with this idea. I mean, like I
Mm,
already mentioned, direct perception existed. It just was written so early on. And also people had been saying it for a long time. We need this, we need this, we need this. So we filled a very well-defined and asked for gap. It wasn't, a flash of insight. Like it was something people have been talking about. And many of us are professors who care a lot about education, and so anytime a paper would come out that explained things in a way that was graspable, it would make the rounds, right? People would be emailing it around, and you could just tell there was like such a thirst for good undergraduate resources. So I was like, all right, we got to do something about this.
yeah. And as I said, a very welcome contribution it is too. A couple of questions in from the YouTube chat here. One from Fred Cummins, who notes that he's found Tony Chimero's book to be useful at least at master's level. And I guess this leads into a query about the relationship between ecological and enactive approaches.
Yes.
So essentially, have you addressed that? Is there any appetite or sort of perceived need to get into that debate in any way?
Yes. And this is why the last bit of the talk was me saying, please send me resources. So somebody said Tony Chimero's book. I will go, I will look at it, I will read it. It's tough because I was trained in the ecological perspective from CESPA. So that is, of course, where my knowledge is. It's where my strength is. And it's not that we purposefully excluded any other thoughts. I absolutely would like to include those. I just am not as well trained in those areas. This is why I was saying, like, send me stuff. Say, if you've got Tony Chimero's book, I'll pick it up. Great. I haven't read it yet. I'll read it now. I will get anything I can to sort of, I'm trying to look for like diversify the thought,
Mm,
because the point of the book is to be introducing them to the whole field, not just my perspective of the field.
mm.
So, our perspective of the field, I should say.
And again, a sort of similar kind of comment as before, which is that the field is now big enough to have developed nuance and a good healthy bit of infighting too. A little bit of
Yep.
disagreement over approaches and
I'll tell you, this is a old story, but the very first conference that I ever went to in ecological, and I do not remember who was involved, so don't ask because it was my first one. I had no idea who anybody was, but somebody gave a talk on affordances, and somebody else was very mad, and then there was yelling, and I thought these people were going to come to blows, and I kind of leaned over and was like to Claudia, I was like, "Is it always like this?" It's like, no, but yes, right? A good, healthy debate. It's good for us. It's good for
certainly
science.
is. Yeah, no, absolutely. Slight shift then, and this is actually Alan's question, and apologies to Alan, who was originally here live until I ran into whatever changes in Zoom and YouTube
Zoom hiccup.
I continue to struggle with. Nevertheless, I'll eventually figure this out. It's funny how technology gradually makes you unskilled at something that you've practiced quite a bit
Yeah,
just by changing things up.
feel better.
Nevertheless, from Alan here, how is the target audience different for the upcoming sensing and perceiving versus the intro to eco-psych?
Yeah, so the sensing and perceiving book is for a sensation and perception class. The ecological book is for an ecological class. So again, this is like a personal opinion, but I feel like so often a sensation and perception class really just becomes a sensation class. And so it's just people teaching just biology straight up and not really getting to the perception part of that story. Um, a lot of the time. And so the goal there is to have a sensation and perception class that actually covers both sensation and perception. And that really is inextricably different. So I would see that as sort of an earlier class. I would think of sensation and perception being like the first class you would take, and then you would take ecological as a follow-up class. Or maybe it would be a good book for like a beginning student at CESPA who was drowning and didn't understand any of the literature and could read that book and understand the literature a little better. So maybe that audience as well. I sort of see them as being uh, paired. Like I don't think they're competing with each other. I think you'd want to read both.
Mm. I mean, I think it was an interesting observation about when you mentioned like when the field was just trying to get itself started and the defensiveness that's required, right? You have to sort of almost literally stake out a turf, and you have to
Yeah.
fight off people who are attempting to reinterpret you, really, or kind of
Yes.
assimilation. And the interesting observation that was made that when the journal was founded, which was almost, it's one of the means by which you stake out an academic
Yes.
identity. You say, well, we will have a venue, and this will be ours, and um, it was called ecological psychology, not ecological approaches to visual perception or
Right.
equivalent.
Right.
It was sort of a very clear statement about extent or
Yeah.
range, which isn't necessarily there in, I guess, the initial Gibsonian work specifically. But
Right. But I think that it should be. I mean, now, I mean, I have strong feelings about this. Actually, this is a sort of a pet thing, but I think that it's a grand unifying theory of psychology. I think when you start wandering into this is why I was saying, we got this clinical psychologist, we got this social psychologist, all these people from other areas of psychology that are covered in the text, but are not necessarily like deeply represented in the field. I'm like, but we should be because you look at classic views of clinical, right? And you see, oh, well, they have the unconscious, right? Well, that's the same thing as the central executive. That's the same thing. It's the same thing. They've just given it a different name and given it different, magical powers. And I think you could have a view of clinical that used these ecological ideas to great effect, right? And I feel the same way about a lot of areas of psychology, that this should be a broad theory that doesn't just apply to perception, action, and cognition, but to social and to community. Oh, that's the other one. A community psychologist, very interested. Um, you know, um, um, oh, there's somebody, the other one was computer science. Apparently, affordances, one of the places they've escaped the lab into is in computer science. And there is a big push in computer science to understand affordances better.
mm,
There's a guy at my university. We were in a writing group together, and we talk about what it is that we're working on. And one day after the writing session, he was like, "Well, I've been writing this section on affordances," and I was like, and he said, "Yeah, I've been doing this reading, and I don't actually think they were invented by insert name of
Norman,
guy I've never
yeah,
heard here. They were actually invented by this guy named Gibson." And I was like, not to be this person, but have you read my book? Like, it was just this very strange interaction. And we've talked a few times since then, and he has read my book at this point. But, getting all these different fields, anything that is human interactive, you're going to want to have a better sense of the way that the perception works.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting that the computer science thing is particularly interesting because I came across one now. It's several years ago, um, but it was an observation that sort of ecological psychology and the ecological approach to perception uh, sort of dominates in certain areas of computer science because it was the only way to get virtual reality to work.
Yeah,
If you take too kind of old school, sort of a
doesn't work.
traditionalist, image processing view of perception, you cannot make virtual reality work.
Right.
And
Yes.
so I think that's kind of one of those interestingly sort of illustrative points that doesn't get hammered enough.
Yeah.
Um, I
And
guess it
and the
requires particular
the more that
uh,
you buy in, the more you buy in, the better it gets,
Yeah.
right? African did a whole thing on VR and the ways that it didn't really capture body sway quite right and was making women more than men. So that's sort of an interesting thing. Far more motion sick because they weren't taking into account all the things that we know about body sway and how we use it to, it provides information about our surroundings. And that when they like really leaned into that, it worked a lot better,
Mm.
so
Yeah.
exactly. So yes, it should get hammered more.
Yes.
It
Um,
works.
it does. Um, so you'd think that would matter in science, but let's not go there.
We
Uh,
digress.
yeah. So a number of other comments coming in on via YouTube and kind of comments to enable. Now there's a few from Miguel Segundo Ortin. Book ended with great book, right? So
Oh,
we're starting
thanks.
with awesome. This is great. We're going to finish with awesome. This is great, and then there's going to be a few comments in the middle.
Great.
So
Excellent.
and
Compliment
mostly I
sandwich.
think
Let's
this
go.
is people are already enthused with what else should be there. And Miguel thinks there should be a lot more Eleanor. Eleanor
Yeah.
Gibson should be playing as a much more fundamental role
Oh, you
in.
mean the person, not the little baby in the book. Okay, yes.
Oh yes, sorry, yes, Jackie. So yeah, Eleanor Gibson, just to sort of significantly expand it, I guess.
Excellent.
And Miguel also suggests a little more in terms of the historical sources,
Mhm.
and also the possibility for, and I guess this is interesting, the normative shaping of perception. So I guess we're getting into Alan Costal and that aspect of things, which are sort of bringing out the kind of more social aspects of the ecology of behavior and experience, which I guess are more recent developments in the field in some aspects. Although I say more recent as though Alan Costal hadn't been going on about it for decades.
I would just ask for all of those people who are making these very, very helpful suggestions, email me. Email me what you have because I want to know. I want to know what you think should be included. So bring it on.
Mm. Excellent. So Jamie Kinney is wondering, I guess, could this be useful for students of inaction? Which is probably a harsh question for you. It's like,
Yeah, I don't
oh yes,
know.
is the answer. I think you can confidently say yes. Um,
Yes.
the I mean, there's to me, it's as you said that this is a it's a unifying theory of psychology, not because it takes a whole bunch of disparate areas and unifies them, but rather
No.
refuses to break them up in the first place.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
as soon as you have sort of a clear theory of this is how embodied agents interact with their environment,
Yes.
you've got a theory of psychology, and you don't need to slice and dice it into different ways. You just need to
Yes.
articulate it in more nuanced ways for particular contexts.
I
Um,
want I want to amplify something you just said there about not that it's not so much that's bringing these areas together so much as refusing to separate them in the first place. I can't tell you how much that resonates with me because I've felt that for a lot of years that all of those areas were all just it's all the same thing and it should be using similar guiding posts, and I just wanted to amplify that. I liked it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that has led to the miscategorization and misunderstanding of ecological psychology. From my perspective, is you'll see people who think, well, it's all very good for perception and action, but I'm interested in the really important stuff.
Right. As if
Because
perception and action aren't important and
yeah,
fundamental.
and essentially it's that Susan Hurley calls it the classical sandwich view, right? You have perception and you have action, and cognition is everything that happens in between.
Yeah.
And that is, and everything, because the perception and action are just transduction.
Yeah.
It's just like get the information in and then sort of put it back out again.
Yeah.
All of psychology happens in the middle,
Yeah.
and has to be dealt with separately. But once you realize that's not the case,
Not the
um,
case.
it really transforms everything.
And it's interesting because you actually are seeing, so I keep bringing up clinical. My sister actually has her PhD in clinical psychology. So she and I have spent some time, discussing clinical psychology. And it's interesting because one of the rising stars of clinical psychology right now is the cognitive behavioral therapy, right? The whole premise of which is that our behavior and our actions are continuous with our thoughts. And so while you don't always have control over your thoughts, you do have control over your actions to a certain extent. So changing your actions changes your thoughts.
Mm,
So they still sort of separate it into these like two different categories, but one's so inextricably linked that you can influence one with the other. And I think like the fact that that is a rising star is because it works, right? We're back to this pragmatic, if it works, maybe we should talk some more about it, you
mm.
know? Anyway.
That's it. It's the the breaking of the connection between mind and world that essentially was the almost the defining premise of cognitive psychology.
Yeah,
Um, had just such thoroughgoing implications
yeah,
that
yeah.
it's going to take psychology a long time to dig itself out from that.
Yeah, and the distinction between mind and body, and
Mm,
all of these dualisms that you find kind of, I mean I talk about it a while in the book too, because I agree. I think that's where sort of our fundamental problems started, and you see those fundamental ideas over everything in every area of psychology you can imagine. And so I almost think that's why we had an easier time in, making inroads into something like uh, computer science, because they didn't have the baggage, right? So, like I said in the talk, you always have to unteach first before you can teach. Well, if they never learned it in the first place, they're
mm,
much more open to the, oh, well, we can just do it this way. This way works. So let's
mm,
do that.
yeah. No, that's excellent. Jamie Kinney is hoping that it's out for the spring. I think you have to disappoint him on that one, but do you want to refresh
Yeah, it's due to
when
our
the books are
publishers
coming out?
August 1st. And like there's a very real chance we'll make that deadline. It's like it's possible
Mm,
that we will make that deadline. I've been on sabbatical this semester, so I've been working hard. I think my memory about the way this happened with the last one is that it's almost a year from when we turn it in to when it actually hits the shelves. Because once you turn it in, there's a whole process where they have to make a formatting situation and they put it together and you do proofs and then you have to correct everything. And then somebody comes in and puts in a bunch of semicolons for no reason and you have to take all the semicolons back out. And, so there's a whole process there. And it just takes time and we're not in control of any of it. So I don't think it's going to be out in time for the spring, but I do think it will be out in time for the following fall. That's the goal.
excellent. Superb. So yeah, I guess I'll give the YouTube chat another moment or two to see if there's any sort of final follow-up questions or points. While that's happening, I will sort of continue to sort of plug. We're just going to go full on ads because as a thing, I think
Mhm.
my introduction might have been cut off a little bit there.
Do
But
it.
yeah, so I mean the whole series of books, I don't have all of them, and I also have a bone to pick with your production team because I have 5 different books that are 4 different sizes.
Yeah. Oh
It,
no.
it's just weird.
It bothers me too. If it's any consolation, we had words. It turns
Mm.
out they switched publishers in the middle of the run. And so while some of them are the same size and then they change, and then I'm not in
These
charge.
are small gripes for what are otherwise excellent. So I don't
Fine.
have the full. I don't have Luis Favela's Ecological Brain, which I'm very much looking forward to getting hold of
Oh,
yet.
it's a good one.
But
That's a really good one.
the whole series and Rob Withagen going for novella rather than novel, but concise and to the point.
If I get a chance to like do a little bit of a commercial too, we are always looking for new authors. So if you have ever thought, hey, I'm interested in writing a book, we can help you with that. We can help you with maybe even putting you together with a co-author if you don't want to do it all by yourself. We can help and walk you through the whole process. It is much easier than it sounds. So
Excellent.
please do
So
contact
that's
us.
it.
That's
And
my
you will be
commercial.
getting responses from people who are coming across this YouTube video in 2 years, wondering,
Excellent.
wondering all about
Good.
that. But we should all, Miguel's here, so we should plug Miguel's book. Hang on a second.
Oh, yes.
There we go. That's
So good.
the
Good.
Harry Heft one, which is wonderful.
They're all
And
good. I've
they are
really
all good.
enjoyed
And
it.
those are the 2 that are the same size. Look.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep. And then there'll be another two that are the same size, and then it'll switch again. I don't know what to tell you. I am not in charge.
yeah.
but I will say that I'm in charge of, the Jeff and I together, we decide which books actually make it. And it's maybe one of my favorite things to read all the proposals and, say, oh, this book and help people craft it into a thing that will work. And, then I get a copy. That's what I get in return for being the editor of the series. So I own all of them. They're in my work office instead of my home office, but I own them all. And it's great.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I mean, thank you for the service to the community, and
My
for
part.
I'll be looking forward to getting hold of the sensing and perceiving when it makes an appearance.
Thank you. We're really excited about it. And thank you for having me on here.
No, a pleasure. Okay, so thanks everyone. This wraps up the. Obviously, we won't have another 2024, but the series will continue. We're going to take a hiatus in January, and then we will be back in February for February 2025 for another ENSO seminar. So I'll just say thanks again, Julia, and we'll see you all in 2025.
See you then.
So the live